There's a debate in the comments on my video about the collectivization of farming in the Soviet Union, about whether the United States had a comparable famine in the 1930s during the Great Depression. Did the United States have a famine in the 1930s? No. But did people starve in the United States in the 1930s? Yes. So let's talk about it. There was not a famine in the United States during the Great Depression or as a result of the Great Depression. By famine, I mean a crop failure and or food shortages. There was not a crop failure and there were not food shortages during the 1930s. This commenter cites the statistic that in the United States, wheat yields dropped precipitously during the Great Depression, which is true. But that was because in the 1920s, the United States had been producing a large surplus of wheat that farmers had been selling to markets abroad. That led to a high price of wheat, that led to a speculative market, a huge surplus, and a precipitous fall during the Great Depression when those markets for wheat disappeared. So the United States was producing too much wheat, and there was a correction during the 1930s. So there were not crop failures leading to a famine in the United States in this time period. There also were not food shortages in the United States in this time period. But there was starvation. It was not anywhere close to the scale of the starvation that happened during the collectivization of farming in the Soviet Union, which was a number that is difficult to determine, but somewhere in the hundreds of thousands, possibly in the millions of people. In the United States, there was starvation more on the scale of hundreds, perhaps thousands of people in the United States, which is a relatively large number for the United States, which has not typically seen famine in its history. So what happened? The starvation that happened in the United States was because the United States, at the beginning of the Great Depression, did not have a social safety net of any kind. The only social safety net they had to speak of was a pension system for veterans of World War I, and there were issues with that money getting to the veterans, so much so that the veterans staged several high-profile protests. So the United States did not have a social safety net, and what little tiny social safety net they might have had, they were not very good at executing. The United States did not have any social protections of any kind if someone were to fall into poverty. The only protections that they had were charities who ran what they called soup kitchens at the time, because what they typically served was soup, and they would provide meals to the poor. But they were in no way prepared for the scale of poverty that happened during the Great Depression. So these charitable institutions that had been around for several hundred years and were serving a certain segment of the population were no way prepared to serve as many people as they needed to serve in this time period. So people were not able to get food. There was also a classic resistance, and this is true of the United States to this day, to the idea that people should get fed just because they're poor. There was an idea that held all through this time period, even though it wasn't true, that poor people were lazy, that if they fell into poverty, it was because of their own lack of initiative, their own foolishness. People loved to blame the poor for their situation, and that did not change because of the Great Depression. There was still that attitude in the United States. Now, that it wasn't everybody in the United States, as I've discussed in some earlier videos. Plenty of socialists in the United States, plenty of union organizers in the United States. As we've discovered, there were some anarchists in the United States. So there were people in the United States who did have sympathy for the newly poor, the newly unemployed, the people who were really struggling during the Great Depression. And those people did manage to get FDR elected into office and managed to agitate for a lot of changes to institute a social welfare system in the United States. But when the Great Depression started, it wasn't there. And so people didn't have enough to eat, and some people didn't make it. So there was a deep, deep need for the social safety net that wasn't there. So, what social safety nets came out of the Great Depression? Well, against great resistance to many parts of the United States government, FDR was able to institute a few social programs. Mostly, he instituted work programs. So, he instituted the Conservation Corps, which was people that they hired to go and take care of national parks. He did the Works Progress Administration, which was people that he hired to build government buildings, and he hired artists to produce works of art for the government. These social programs were small in scale and were kind of a drop in the bucket. And so they didn't actually really help to get the Great Depression to end the way that World War II did, because World War II ended up being like the real jobs program for the United States. Like that really put people back to work. But it was a small step in the right direction. He also instituted Social Security. So Social Security is an insurance program for people in the United States so that they will have some sort of retirement income so that they are not in abject poverty. It is meant to be a baseline for the elderly in the United States so that they do not live out their elder years in poverty. I have had a few very aggravating conversations with conservatives in my family about how they wish that they could take the money from their Social Security and invest it in the stock market because they could do much better. They could get much better returns if they did it in the private sector. This public sector is a waste of money, right? But I had to very calmly explain to them that the Social Security system exists specifically in case something happens with the stock market, so that if you have your money invested in the stock market and you lose everything, you will still have Social Security. So that was a huge bit of progress that still exists today. So the issue in the United States during the Great Depression was not a lack of food, it was a lack of the systems to distribute food and a lack of a social safety net. If any of you have read the book The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, it's a book that he wrote after living with folks who were traveling from the Dust Bowl states to California to look for work. He describes farmers piling oranges into piles and lighting them on fire because it was thought that if you gave these oranges away, that you were going to make the market for food even worse, that the prices would always stay low if you gave this food away, that people would start to expect free food and they would never want to pay for it again. And they were burning these oranges because they felt like the price wasn't high enough for them to be able to sell them. So that really illustrates the attitude of the United States at the time, that they would rather burn this product rather than give it to the tent camp down the street. And in a lot of ways, this attitude persists until Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty in the 1960s, when the country does finally institute a full social safety net, which has been rolled back a bit in recent years. But there still is payment to parents with dependent children, which is what they used to call welfare, and there still is a program called WIC, which is what we used to call the food stamp program, where people who are low income can get a monthly subsidy for groceries. And Lyndon Johnson instituted these War on Poverty reforms because it was thought that it looked bad to have a wealthy country and a prosperous country like the United States having people in it who were in such abject poverty. And so Lyndon Johnson advocated for these reforms to make it so that the floor in the United States was that much higher. One of the reasons that he wanted to institute this was because one of the arguments that the Soviet Union would make against capitalism is that capitalism causes this poverty. And so it was good PR for capitalism to have these social safety nets in place. Social safety nets, which, if you think about it, are actually socialist. So, in conclusion, was there a famine in the 1930s in the US? No. Was there starvation? Yes.